Okay, thank you for your patience. We have the technical issues worked out. Welcome to all. For those of you who don't know who's in the room, we have members of JCC and JCL from across the street. Obviously, folks from this building, which is, I'm just kidding, Jewish Family and Career Services. We have also board members that have joined us, and members of Sowing Seeds of Faith are not here yet, but will be here shortly. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation. I'm particularly looking forward to this talk, and where are you? Before I do that, where's Valisa? What? Stand up. In case I'm not here at the end, because I may have to leave abruptly. I just want to thank you, and I want us all to give you a round of applause for the great work you've done. And not just with this talk, but with all that you're doing for us with DI Plus and Navigate. This talk in particular, I think, is exciting for us as JFCS to be thinking about. In addition to this being Black History Month, this talk in particular, as you know, as you can probably see, is the title, Yes, You Can. And the reason why that matters from my perspective is that it also takes on this holistic look and a positive, strengths-based look at folks we serve and our community. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Chaka Cummings is the inaugural executive director of the Association for Teaching Black History in Kentucky. Mr. Cummings' career in education has spanned various K-12 roles, grade levels, and subjects. Mr. Cummings has been a principal, a teacher, and administrator in schools in Kentucky, Texas, Florida, and Minnesota, which he looks way too young for that, if you ask me, but that's a whole other story. He specializes in teaching social sciences, specifically American history, world history, and geography. Mr. Cummings received his degree in education series from Berea College, an MBA from the University of Kentucky, and is working toward his PhD in higher education studies with an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion at the University of Kentucky. I will also add that I know Valisa's had multiple conversations with Mr. Cummings. I was privy to one of those, and it was a very exciting, insightful conversation, and I think that's what this talk is going to be as well. So, Mr. Cummings, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Good morning. So here's what I don't do normally, right? I'm a teacher, but I'm a football coach. I would never use this. I would yell at the kicker at the back of the room, right? And like, I will do my best, however, because I know that in terms of accessibility, there's some folks for whom the microphone is absolutely necessary. So if I am not, maybe giving me a heads up I need to get back to the mic would be awesome. Chaka Cummings. I've taught every grade level from pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. I have been an admissions person. I've been a fundraiser. I've been an assistant principal. I've been a principal. I've been an athletic director. I've taught PE, English, religion, math, English, and the social studies. If it's been done in a school, I have done it, right? With the exception of maybe working in the cafeteria, but I've slung a couple of slices of pizza in my day, absolutely. I have the privilege of working for the Association for Teaching Black History in Kentucky. Our conversation today is really around the work that we're trying to get folks who are interested, regardless of their sphere, to engage in. So I talk to a lot of teachers, but I very intentionally don't use the word teacher a ton unless I'm describing myself. I use the word educator. When I went to school, we were always told that any adult in the building is an educator. We are all adults in this space, and if we are adults in front of children, we are educating whether we want to or not, right? And so I like to get us in that frame of mind as we begin to engage in the discussion. Before that, I want to tell you a little bit about the association. Our goal is to make sure that the historical experiences and stories of Black Kentuckians are not lost. We want to make sure that that's a part of the fabric of all the curriculum across the Commonwealth. And the reality is that, we'll get into it today, it's a pretty interesting history, and there's a lot to celebrate across the entirety of our state. However, a lot of conversation has been politicized, and so we lose the fact that there's this robust history in political discourse that actually doesn't serve our students at all. And so I want to support teachers by making sure they have all the resources that they need, I want to support folks in the community with talking points and access to materials. If you need something to effectively talk about Kentucky's Black history, we are the place to go in order to support folks who want to have that conversation. Now, very specifically, if you want to get in touch with us, that QR code, if you scan that with whatever mobile device you have, it'll send you an email, it'll add you to our listserv, you'll get our newsletters, you'll get all of the information whenever we're doing speaking engagements, those sorts of things, whatever programming we are doing. So feel free to scan, send an email. Also, if you are a social media person, you can follow us, we're on all the things. And so wherever you feel like it's best to interact with the association, please give us a follow. It helps us out greatly. So now I want to talk about Black history, and I want to talk about frameworks for teaching Black history. Happy February. It's interesting. I get to do these talks so much during this month. And the reality is that if we're doing this effectively, the conversation extends well beyond this month, right? These are books written by a man by the name of LeGarrette King. When I say Dr. King in this sense, I mean LeGarrette, right? Because when I say Dr. King, folks think of some other folks, especially this month. Dr. LeGarrette King is probably the foremost scholar in the country in terms of teaching Black history K-12. He's written multiple books, right? And he's developed this framework around effective teaching of Black history. And that framework has developed from a reality that exists with regard to Black history, but let's broaden our horizons a bit. It's a reality that exists with any sort of history around someone whose identity has been marginalized. The reality is that when we talk about any sort of non-majority history based on identity, when we begin to talk about that history, we spend a lot of time talking about things like power and oppression in terms of a dynamic. And if you only spend time in the power and oppression bucket when having these conversations around diverse histories, you may unintentionally send the message to folks who are listening that that is the fullness of the historical experience. And so LeGarrette King says we need to make sure that we are not doing that. That, like, if we're going to talk Black history and you're only going to talk slavery, you're better off not talking Black history. Because enslavement is not the only part of Black history. The great thing about having this conversation with this audience, in this state, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, so I'll reference it now. In this state, we are required to make sure that students learn about the Holocaust. There's a book called People Love Dead Jews. I don't know if folks in this space have read this book. We got a hand in the back of the room. Like, the reality that many folks in this room understand is that if you only spend time talking power and oppression, then folks think that that's the entirety of your history. Jewish history is not entirely the Holocaust. However, we're required to teach that, much in the same way that we teach enslavement. If we don't broaden the histories of those who have been minoritized, those who have been marginalized, then the power and oppression dynamic is what folks think is the entirety of the history. LeGarrette King says, think more broadly than that with regard to Black history, and I'll talk to you a little bit later about how we can take this framework and apply that to any sort of marginalized history. So let's think about, in the face of power and oppression, let's think about perseverance. Let's think about resilience. Let's think about resistance, because that should be a part of the conversation as well. We should also think about, with regard to Black history, like ancient African civilizations, because that is the genesis of Black people on this planet. We should also be thinking about joy. And if we don't talk about Black joy when we talk about Black history, we're not talking about the fullness of the Black experience. And trust me, I'm a Black man from Harlem, New York. I've had plenty of experiences that were not full of joy. I've also had plenty of experiences that were abundantly full of joy. I grew up in an era where hip-hop was budding. I had block parties in my back park. My brother is a DJ. He was in Ibiza 2 months ago doing his thing. My uncle is one of the founding members of the Fabulous Five, which is a tagging crew. They used to spray paint street trains, do the whole car. Go look up Slave One. That's my uncle, Kenneth Durant. I know joy. And so if we don't talk joy, then we're not talking about the fullness of the Black experience. And we have to be real about an intersectional analysis of what it means to be black. You need to do that in the contemporary. Because, and I used to say this quite a bit when I was teaching in the classroom, if I'm only talking about dead white guys, I lose all my students. They can Google all that. We have to talk about some people who are alive today. One of the pieces that my students would always say to me is like, Mr. Cummings, why don't we ever get to the Cold War? We talk all this American history, we spend all this time talking about Crispus Attucks, and we talk about the Americans, we never get to the Cold War. They weren't even asking for like contemporary history in like 2019, they just wanted to get to the 80s. So like, if we are not doing any sort of contemporary analysis, you're going to lose folks in the conversation. And the reality is that this is the perfect time to have some contemporary analysis about marginalized identity and conversations around history. LeGarrette King has put together this framework. And again, this framework works for any sort of marginalized history. But here's the thing. LeGarrette King, when he created this framework, he just created it from best practices in teaching the social studies. In other words, when you experience social studies as a student, you got these things when talking about majority history. So when we talk about American history and we talk about the founding of America, we talk about these things. If you talk about European history, we talk about these things. What LeGarrette King is simply saying is take this and apply it to all peoples and think about the identities around which you are centering your history and make sure that you are intentional around including these elements with regard to those identities. Does that make sense? Awesome. I love seeing head shakes. By the way, conversation. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. It doesn't bother me at all. You can actually shout out, because that's how football practice would normally work. I even have a clicker. This is awesome. So we talked about like best practices in teaching, but one of the other pieces that's important to understand with regard to Kentucky's history is that we do an incredible job in Kentucky, in this Commonwealth, of discussing localized history. And we do that across the entirety of the Commonwealth. Now, I don't know how many folks in the room are from Kentucky. I told you guys I'm from Harlem. I'm from New York City. I got to Kentucky in 1998 in order to attend Berea College, and I've had an affiliation with Kentucky ever since. Here's what I know about Kentucky. If you go into the most rural of rural areas across this state, and you ask folks about the names on the street signs, whose holler is that? Whose house is that? Who's on this particular building for 6 generations? Whose family's been on that farm since 18 whatever? Like, we know those histories in the Commonwealth. And I will say this, like, it's a core competency of Appalachia just in general, that we actually do a really good job of understanding these elements. And so when we start talking about black history, we're actually very well equipped to have a conversation about localized Kentucky history because we do a great job of understanding our local history. And we really are equipped to do this around any sort of marginalized identity because we have an understanding of the peoples who live in the places and the spaces in which we occupy. We do a great job of this. Go to Florida. They don't do such a great job of this. Why don't they do such a great job of this? Because half the people aren't from there. Go to Arizona, it's the same thing, right? But we have peoples who have chosen to stay or people who migrate into the area and stick around for a while. So they tend to know those localized elements of history. So can we take that and apply it to marginalized identities? Can we apply that to black history? I think so. It's kind of my job to make sure that we can. So I'm going to talk to you all about how we do that. So we talked about LeGarrette King and spending too much time in terms of power and oppression and utilizing a framework to kind of have the conversation. Now, when you begin talking black history, what LeGarrette King tells us is that you cannot ignore power and oppression. There has to be a real part of the conversation. When we get into some of the politicized elements of conversation now with regard to black history, the problematic element is that it seems that we don't always want to have the honest conversation around power and oppression. And it's like, well, let's just be honest about what's happened in the past. Because if you talk about what's happened in the past, you have an understanding of how things have happened, why things have happened, you're much less likely to repeat them in the future. This is not, by the way, like best practices in social studies. This is best practices in dealing with children. When children make a mistake, what do? We ask them to talk to us about what they did in the past, own it in the present to make sure they don't repeat it in the future, right? We don't want our kiddo to go punch someone. If they do punch someone, well, why'd you punch them? Okay, let's not do that. Here's what we could do different. We have these conversations because it's best practices in dealing with students, in dealing with children. It applies to the social studies as well. Power and oppression really is representative of that. Like, you have to have the honest conversation around what's happened because it provides context for where we are. And so as we start to talk about power and oppression, you don't want to lose this. But again, if you are only talking enslavement as Black history, you are missing an incredible opportunity to talk a lot more robustly about the history of Black people. Now, in our Commonwealth, we can have a great conversation with regard to power and oppression. In our Commonwealth, we have two land-grant institutions. The University of Kentucky, I proudly attended. I'm sure that there are Redbirds in the room. I appreciate y'all for being here. University of Kentucky and Kentucky State University. Those are the two land-grant institutions in our Commonwealth. They were founded as two separate land-grant institutions. Why? Because one was for white people and one was for Black people. That's the reality. Kentucky State University is an HBCU, historically Black college and university. That's where Black students were allowed to attend, and they were not allowed to attend the University of Kentucky until, thank goodness, Lyman T. Johnson came along. That's our history. We should talk about that history because you can actually have that conversation in the contemporary. And like there are elements of it that you could talk about right now because quite literally, the Secretary of Education talked about the underfunding of HBCUs across the country, talked about somewhere in the neighborhood like $100 million that Kentucky State's been underfunded since the 70s. That's a real conversation, like really in the news. You can really Google like really right now. You think kids would like to talk about that? Maybe they would, especially kids who are thinking about going to college, right? They're like in that mindset anyway. So you can actually have a great conversation around power and oppression, and I never mentioned enslavement. We can have that conversation as well, but let's have that conversation in greater context because the realities of this country are that the legacy of enslavement is represented in elements like this. Black agency, resilience, perseverance. So now we're starting to move away from power and oppression. We're going to start to talk about Black people and the fact that there were no Black people who just allowed themselves to be enslaved. They consciously fought against the systems of oppression that existed, and we should recognize that fight. LaGarrett King wants to make sure that that's a conscious part of the conversation for students, because otherwise, students may get the misnomer that somehow 1619 Africans brought upon the shore and they just let everything that happened to them happen to them. It's like that's not the reality. There's like lots of examples that we could actually cite, whether that's national history or whether that's the Commonwealth's history. So let's make sure that that's a part of the story, right? Let's make sure that we're decentering this possible narrative of what people have allowed to happen to them and actually shift the narrative to how folks fought against systems of oppression and show examples of how one can fight against systems of oppression historically that can maybe give us some context for how we could do that right now. So some examples that are very pertinent to the Commonwealth. I don't know where everyone in the space is from. My wife is from Carter County, Kentucky. I love describing Carter County, Kentucky, because most folks have not been to Carter County. Raise your hand if you've been to Carter County. Awesome. This is most of the rooms I've been in. There's like one guy. Raise your hand if you've heard of Grayson, Kentucky. Okay. Awesome. Outside of Grayson is a town called Hitchens. Raise your hands if you've heard of Hitchens, Kentucky. Awesome. My wife grew up in Denton, outside of Hitchens. That's where she grew up. When we think about Eastern Kentucky, when we think about Appalachia, when we think about the mountains, there are some images that maybe populate our mind, many of those based on stereotypes that have been perpetuated by popular media. Maybe some of those based on our own personal experience. How many of us think about the Underground Railroad? You should. Have you been to Ashland, Kentucky? Boyd County? Because there's an Underground Railroad stop in Boyd County. Have you been to Greenup County? Because there's an Underground Railroad stop there too. And it makes sense that there'd be Underground Railroad stops there because you can get to Ohio when enslavement was outlawed. You had to go through Kentucky to get to a place like Ohio, and maybe you settled in Ohio, and so we can actually look at some of the history with regard to Black settlements of towns that are in southeastern Ohio. But some folks just continued on, right? And they went as far north as Canada. Incidentally, in our city of Louisville, we also had a very similar element. We had Underground Railroad stops, right? The reason why Fort Wayne, Indiana looks the way that Fort Wayne, Indiana looks is because Louisville was here. People would go to Fort Wayne and settle. But some folks continued going, right? And they would continue moving north. And that's a part of the Commonwealth's history as well. There were 13 different stops along the Underground Railroad in the northern portions of the Commonwealth that allowed enslaved folks to get to places where enslavement was outlawed. Raise your hand if you heard that when you were in social studies class. Why not? You want to talk to me about problematic elements of history. Who in Greenup County, where the population is 94% white, is going to feel bad about hearing that there was an Underground Railroad stop in their town that they could go visit? But if we only talk power and oppression, we miss this opportunity for students who need to hear this history to actually hear about an element of their local community around which they'd be incredibly proud. And maybe it would even be worth it to them to celebrate. Friends, it is the year of our Lord, 2024. 60 years ago, that other Dr. King marched about 30 miles to the east of us in Frankfurt. Like, in schools, we should be talking about that ad nauseum during the month of February. But we should be talking about it ad nauseum during the entire year of 2024. Dr. King, as a part of his movement around labor, came to Frankfurt, got local young people galvanized to lead a march on the Capitol in Frankfurt. And we are 60 years removed from that. Here's a couple of things to note. Number one, we're only 60 years removed. Like, this history is not ancient history. But the other element to note is that because we're only 60 years removed, we could actually engage in conversations around Dr. King's March in Frankfurt and get folks who were there on that day to come talk to us about it. I was in the room when Dr. Bill Turner talked about being there that day. I've had the opportunity to meet several folks who were in Frankfurt, part of the organizing of the march, got to shake Dr. King's hand, and who can go into classrooms and talk to students about that experience. We should take advantage of that opportunity in 2024, because I cannot promise you that those people will be here in 2034. So let's take advantage of that opportunity now. If you are interested in learning more about the Underground Railroad and the stops in our Commonwealth, Dr. Alistine Turley wrote a book called The Gospel of Freedom. It is all about evangelical ministers who supported the Underground Railroad, stops along the Underground Railroad, and made sure that folks could get out of enslavement into places where enslavement was outlawed. If you're interested in learning more about Dr. King's March, PBS actually did, KET, did a great documentary 10 years ago for the 50th anniversary. They're actually going to be redoing some things this year. Be on the lookout from stuff from KET, be on the lookout from stuff from Kentucky Historical Society. Like, there's powerful opportunity to begin to engage in this conversation, right? Oh, by the way, if you're available on Thursday, there's going to be a talk at the Fraser Museum where we're actually talking about Dr. King's March, the 60th anniversary, and the impact. They're letting a lot of important people talk there, and then they're letting me talk for some reason. Who knows why? Let's talk diaspora, a term that many in the room have used multiple times in your lives, right? I go into space, I have to explain what diaspora is very often. Don't think I have to do that for this audience. So when LeGarrette King talks about diaspora, he very specifically uses that term because it references peoples being in a land that was their home being forced out, right? And so when we use that term, it allows us to understand exactly what we're talking about with regard to Africa, African enslavement, colonization, and the realities of black peoples across the continent of Africa. And so it's important to utilize the term diaspora so that folks have an understanding of how actions took place with regard to the removal of Africans from their homes to places literally all over the world in order to participate in enslavement. The other element that sometimes we don't get enough time to discuss with regard to ancient history, we don't talk enough about ancient African civilizations in a way that's meaningful for our students. And it's interesting to me because I had a 5th grade teacher Her name was Miss Danisco. Miss Danisco was 1 year away from retirement. She would tell us that pretty regularly. And Miss Danisco, older Italian woman, grew up in Brooklyn, was teaching at our school. I kid you not, it had to be like the second day of school. She came to class and looked at her students. A class where I imagine, like I don't remember, but I imagine that like 50% of the class was black and probably 75% of the class were people of color. She looked at that class and she said, you know, it's interesting, they got this curriculum for me and I'm supposed to teach European history. I'm not doing that. What are they going to do, fire me? It's my last year. She told you, she would tell us that all the time. She taught ancient African civilizations. That's what we learned about in 5th grade. It was the coolest year ever. It was the first time that I genuinely started to love the social studies. And look at me now. We can engage in terms of histories and get all the elements that we need to talk about with regard to the social studies and elements of geography and elements of civilization. We used to use this acronym called GRAPES, where we talk about geography, religion, achievements. You do all of that with basically any ancient civilization. So we as educators have the opportunity to really pick and choose where we want to focus. And I understand there are state standards. We have to follow said standards. We're not trying to break the law here. That being said, you can always do comparative units. I actually did this quite a bit. I compared medieval Europe to medieval Japan. It gave me an opportunity to talk about ancient Japan, which was a topic that many of my students I was teaching at the time had never heard much about. But there's a lot of similarities between shoguns and knights. And when you tell your kids that, they actually want to pay attention. It was awesome. Had a great couple of weeks, right? So when we start thinking about ancient African civilizations, like we should talk about this in the same vein that we talk about other ancient civilizations, right? If you hear about Mesopotamia, if you hear about Fertile Crescent, I don't understand why you wouldn't hear about Shaka Zulu. I very specifically don't understand why you wouldn't hear about Shaka Zulu. Now, if we want to talk about a Kentucky lens, the great city of Louisville. Louisville participates in the Sister Cities program. Louisville has several sister cities, including Tamale, which is in Ghana. What an incredible opportunity to talk about the name Ghana. The country of Ghana is in West Africa. It is named after an ancient African civilization. The ancient African civilization it is named after did not occupy that land. The civilization was so powerful and so impactful that the country decided to name itself after the Ghanaian civilization. There are ancient African civilizations that were incredibly impactful, incredibly powerful, and we don't talk enough about them. I imagine when we went to school, we heard about terms like bartering and gold salt trade. Like these are things that originated out of Africa. The wealthiest individual, this is like objectively how historians speak, by the way. The wealthiest individual who ever lived in human history, a man by the name of Mansa Musa from ancient African civilizations. He converted to Islam. He did his pilgrimage to Mecca. He had thousands of people with him, adorned in gold and jewels. And when he showed up to Mecca, the folks who saw him and his people had no idea what to do. Like, what do I do with an elephant adorned in gold and jewels? I have no idea. And there's 100 of them. Mansa Musa, incredibly wealthy, start a conversation with the student, ask them who's the wealthiest person that they know, and now talk to them about Mansa Musa, and all of a sudden you got to end to have a conversation about ancient African civilizations. But don't stop at Ghana. You got to talk about Mali. That's Mansa Musa, by the way. You got to talk about the Songhai. You should talk about the Zulu. I love talking about the Zulu. Again, my name is Shaka. For those of you who are unaware of why there's a connection there, Shaka Zulu is a title meaning king of the Zulu, not a person. It's a title. There were multiple Shakas of the Zulu. However, the Shaka Zulu that we tend to know from history is someone who, without gunpowder, without bullets, without guns, beat back the British. In fact, held the British off. The British said, you know what? We aren't going into Central Africa until that dude dies. When he dies, we'll go back. How many of us heard that history? I don't know. If you don't curate your own experience, you may never hear it. And so we should be talking about ancient African civilizations. Now, here's the ancient African civilization that we talk about. It's Egypt. But we never provide a context that those are people of color. We never talk about Egyptians as black people. It's Egypt. We see images of Cleopatra, and Cleopatra doesn't look how Cleopatra looked. And so when we even engage in conversations around ancient African civilization, sometimes it's done disingenuously, if that's intentional, or it's done with an ignorance that needs to be like wiped away, because we need to have real conversations about who people are and where they're from. And so we can have that conversation and have that context around ancient African civilizations, and we get it in with Kentucky's contemporary history with regard to the sister cities. I mean, there's actually lots of ends, because you can actually start talking about, I don't know, Oscar Tshiebwe, former player of the year for the University of Kentucky. Is that a sore spot for Redbirds? I was trying to get under your skin a little bit. I don't know. My favorite topic to talk about is black joy, because when I was in school, I don't know that in class we talked about it enough. But if we were going to talk about it, it would be this month, right? 1 month in February, we would talk about things that were joyous with regard to black people, and then I would have to get into March, and I would have to read Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, and I have to read the word nigger Jim, and my mom would go complain and nobody cared. That was my experience. I can't speak for everyone who's in the room. So now, let's think about joy. And let's think about how we can have greater conversations around joy. Because there's joy in achievement. And there's abundant black achievement in this country. This country literally built by those who were enslaved. And we need to have that conversation. And if we have that conversation in appropriate context, then we can begin to talk about achievement. We can begin to talk about innovation. And we can actually talk about it with a face that maybe looks a little different than some of the names that we always hear about. Because there's nothing wrong with hearing about Thomas Edison, but it's kind of cool to talk about George Washington Carver too. Can we have the conversation about both of them? I think that would be fair, right? With regard to Kentucky in particular, we can have a really cool conversation about joy in this Commonwealth. Okay, I'm a teacher. Y'all ready for a little pop quiz? Awesome. Participate as you feel comfortable. I want you to think of a prominent black Kentuckian. Awesome. I want you to raise your hand when you have an image of a prominent black Kentuckian in your head. Raise your hand. Awesome. Okay, everyone put their hand down for a second. Here's what happens is that I go into spaces like this one, and I ask this question, and pretty regularly, only half to 3/4 of people even raise their hand. They can't even think of a prominent black Kentuckian, which blows my mind, right? That's not judgment, by the way. That's just the reality. So if you were someone who could not think of a prominent black Kentuckian, that is fine. Awesome. So this is a no judgment exercise, so we're not going to be looking around the room to see whose hand is raised, because I need to finish the exercise, but I wanted to just interject that piece. Okay, if you had your hand up, could you keep your hand up? Because I want to participate in the rest of this exercise. If the prominent black Kentuckian that's in your mind right now is Muhammad Ali, would you put your hand down? Awesome. And when I do this in space, what ends up happening is that the overwhelming majority of the room puts their hand down, and I have about 10 hands in a room like this one that are still in the air. Thank you for that. What happens when we talk about black achievement, especially in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, is that the shadow that is cast by Muhammad Ali in terms of black achievement tends to swallow up black achievement with regard to the rest of the Commonwealth. And it is so interesting to me. I boxed from the time I was 5 until the time I was 21. I have 3 pictures of Muhammad Ali in my office. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, your hands can't hit what your eyes can't see, rumble, young man, rumble. I used to scream it before I went out there to go try to knock somebody's head off. So I love Muhammad Ali, and we probably can have a greater conversation and greater context around black achievement than just him, right? So I was doing a talk at a school in Lexington, and there was a student who had transferred in from the school in Lexington from Paris, from Bourbon County. I was talking to the student about Garrett Morgan. Garrett Morgan is a multiple inventor of lots of things that are important, including gas masks and the traffic light. So I start the conversation by talking to folks about, have you driven in a car? Of course, everyone has. Have you stopped at a stoplight? Of course, everyone has. And I talk about the fact that Garrett Morgan invented that thing. Now, it's not the exact thing, but he invented the idea that evolved into the 3-signal stoplight, right? And I talked to them about being from Bourbon County. Garrett Morgan was born in Paris. So I do that talk, and I have a student who comes up after and says, Mr. Cummings, thank you. Because I went to Garrett Morgan Middle School in Paris, Kentucky, and I had no idea who he was. We never talked about why the school was named after him. Quite literally, this man invented something that impacts the lives of people across the world. Black man from Paris, Kentucky, from Bourbon County. I think that a part of why we don't have these conversations is because maybe the legacy of Muhammad Ali, who was probably at one point the most famous person walking the planet, may swallow some of these things. And the reality is that in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, which does not have the monopoly on this, by the way, like, we probably don't talk enough about black achievement in a way that's robust enough to cover folks outside of Muhammad Ali in a way that's going to be memorable for our students. And so I like to talk about lots of folks. In Lexington, we have a street, Oliver Lewis Way. So I remember doing this exercise where I asked folks if they've driven down Oliver Lewis Way. It's a major thoroughfare. Like, you have to turn down that to get to Rupp, you turn down that to get to the Distillery District. Kids are on Oliver Lewis Way all the time. I asked them if they knew who Oliver Lewis was. They had no idea who he was. In this Commonwealth, where the first Saturday in May means something, they have no idea who won the first Kentucky Derby, and they have no idea that he was black. They have no idea that when they go to, like, their grandparents, or even in some cases their great-grandparents' houses, and they have lawn jockey statues outside, and the lawn jockey statue is black, they have no idea why that is. Why is that? Because all the jockeys used to be black. But we don't talk about that with regard to the history of horse racing, and we don't talk about it in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Like, that's interesting, right? We should probably have that conversation because that very much is a part of the local fabric of our Commonwealth. There's a great museum, by the way. Go down to Twin Spires area, right? There's a great museum where they have exhibits on black history in Kentucky horse racing. You should check that out when you get the opportunity. Other folks who I make sure to talk about, Ellis Wilson. So I'm going to mention an individual who is now problematic, but 20 years ago was not problematic and was very much a part of my consciousness every Thursday night at 8 o'clock on NBC. How many of us watch The Cosby Show? Okay, that was a part of our experience, right? There's an episode of The Cosby Show where Claire Huxtable, the matriarch on the show, wanted to purchase a painting. And so the painting was in auction. She goes to the auction. She sees the painting. She must have the painting. She explains to Heathcliff Huxtable, her husband, the patriarch of the show, why she needs to have that painting. She needs to have that painting because her uncle Ellis painted that image. They must have it. It's a family heirloom. Ellis Wilson, prominent artist during the Harlem Renaissance. I learned about Ellis Wilson pretty regularly in art classes growing up because we talked about that localized history within New York City with regard to the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, so fast forward to 1999 when I'm in a class at Berea College, and it's an art history class, and like folks had no idea who Ellis Wilson was. And I was stunned because I was like, that dude's from Mayfield. Like, he's from here. I know that. He went to Kentucky State University. I know that. He then went off to Chicago Art Institute, but Kentucky State University actually reached out to him after he became a little bit more prominent and actually got some of his artwork donated back to them. I knew that. And I knew that from Harlem. And I just wanted folks in Kentucky to know that. Because I think that it's important, especially like you're interested in art, right? A name that's not up here, Monetta Sleet. How many of you are familiar with that name? Monetta Sleet literally won Photograph of the Year. He took a picture of Coretta Scott King at Dr. Martin Luther King's funeral. If you've ever seen a picture of Coretta Scott King sitting in a pew at Dr. Martin Luther King's funeral, that's the image taken by Monetta Sleet Jr., who's from Owensboro. But if we don't talk about this local history and this achievement, like, it gets lost, right? I work at Berea College. I'm a Berea College graduate. I make sure to talk about Carter G. Woodson because Carter G. Woodson is probably the most prominent alum from Berea. First black man to get a PhD from Harvard University. And invented the concept of Black history. Now, many folks mistakenly talk about Carter G. Woodson. They say that he invented Black History Month. That's kind of sort of true, but not really. Carter G. Woodson was a historian and had conversations with politicians about the fact that when we talk about the fullness of when we talk about the fullness of American history, if we don't talk about Black history, we're missing an opportunity and we absolutely have to do it. And that evolved into conversations where we started to have further talks about curriculum. It then led to the creation of Black History Day, which evolved into Black History Month. And that is Carter G. Woodson, graduate from Berea College. So there's a lot of achievement that happens in our Commonwealth. And of course, it's okay to talk about contemporary achievement as well. Like, ask your kids who they view as like prominent Black Kentuckians. When I do this, I get a lot of names of University of Kentucky basketball and football players because I do a lot of this talks in Lexington and Winchester, right? I imagine that you get a lot of Louisville Cardinal folks. If Lamar Jackson's name doesn't come up, it would be kind of a disappointment to me. And that's okay too, because that gives us context to actually have further conversation. Like, we should talk about Lamar Jackson. And the fact that when Lamar Jackson, after winning the Heisman, having the University of Louisville to heights it's never been to, enter the NFL draft, they didn't think he was going to get drafted in the first round. Someone said he should be a wide receiver. You must be out your mind. He needs to be a wide. You know where that comes from. That comes from this mindset that Black athletic football players can't play quarterback. They're too dumb to play the position. And for years, Black men were moved from that position, and they were put at positions like cornerback. Do you know why they play cornerback? For those of you who are unaware of how to play that position, I don't want you to think when you play cornerback. I need you to react. So just put a good athlete out there who can't think. You know how many Black quarterbacks that was their reality? A man by the name of Warren Moon went and played football in Canada rather than let that happen to him. Then he came back to the NFL and threw for 50,000 yards. It's like, oh, maybe they can throw too. Maybe they can think a little bit. Lamar Jackson, I believe, won his second MVP this year. I don't think he won any if he played wide receiver. We can have the conversation about Black achievement in the contemporary as well. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about Black achievement, the Kentucky African American Encyclopedia should be a volume that you have access to, because quite literally, anyone who is a notable Black Kentuckian shows up in this volume. It is a reference volume, so it's not necessarily bedside reading. However, it's something that you can certainly have on your shelf, pull out, and then hopefully have some conversations about some folks that maybe you haven't heard of, and of course reinforce some of the conversations you might have about folks you have heard of. I'm looking at that time. I see that I got 10 minutes. You guys are learning that I'm a teacher. I can fill time like nobody's business. I'm going to go a little bit faster, though, because I want to make sure that we have a conversation around intersectionality and contemporary historical analysis. Let's start with intersectionality. For those who are unfamiliar with the term intersectionality, all of us have multiple components of our identity. So I identify as Black. I identify as male. I identify as a New Yorker who lives in Kentucky. I identify as a Berea College alum. I identify as middle-aged, although if I don't dye my beard, like, I look like Black Santa. So all of these are part of my identity, right? And as we start to think about all those elements of identity, it comes together to make up one individual. That's intersectionality. The term originates from a court case where a lawyer sued a company because the company had a group of Black women who believed they were being discriminated against because they were not being promoted at the same rates as other demographics. The lawyer lost the case. You know why they lost the case? Because the other side proved that Black people were being promoted and women were being promoted. What was lost is that the Black people who were being promoted were Black men and the women who were being promoted were white women. Intersectionality. Black women were suing. So, as we start to have a better understanding of intersectionality, I think that we all have an understanding of what it means to be contemporary. Like, this is a really cool conversation to have with folks, like, right now, because you can have a conversation. You can start it with appropriation. For those who are unfamiliar with appropriation, it's this idea that you look at elements of someone's culture and you utilize it to your own advantage without really, like, having the cultural appreciation for said elements. All right? Music is a great example in terms of Black culture. And if I put that image up on my classroom screen, I got every kid paying attention. For those of you who are unaware, this is Louisvillian Jack Harlow. I have the conversation about appropriation, and I mentioned Jack Harlow. And then I mentioned those folks. Raise your hand if you know who the four folks at the bottom are. Okay, we got a few people. That's Nappy Roots. Nappy Roots out of Bowling Green, Kentucky. I moved here in 1998, going to Berea College. I didn't know Kentuckians could rap because I grew up in New York. I thought it was all country music. Then I learned about bluegrass. I learned that bluegrass was different than country, but I digress. When I heard Po Folks by Nappy Roots, that changed my world. I was like, oh, damn. Kentucky can rap? Oh, whole world is country. I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. The version of My Old Kentucky Home that they rap is kind of dope. I know that the song has become problematic. You should read Emily Bingham's book if you haven't. So we talk about Jack Harlow, Grammy nominated, award winning, sold lots of records. Before Jack Harlow sold a record, Nappy Roots did everything he did. But we don't always talk about Nappy Roots maybe laying the foundation for Kentucky hip hop that allows Jack Harlow to have the status that he occupies now. We probably should talk about it, right? That's what I'm saying. We got some more hip hop being taught for those of y'all who are unaware. Here's what's interesting, because this is the contemporary analysis. Here's what's interesting about the intersectional analysis. You got to look at all parts of identity, right? Jack Harlow identifies as a Louisvillian. He identifies as a Kentuckian, right? And Jack Harlow has made millions of dollars, I can say, singing black music. You might disagree, and that's okay. We can have that conversation. I also grew up in New York City. I know exactly what hip-hop looks like, but we can have the conversation if you're more willing to lose. But here's where I want to get into intersectional analysis. Because how much money did Jack Harlow give to Jeffersontown High School? $200,000, in case you didn't know. You remember them tornadoes that hit Mayfield? Jack Harlow gave $250,000 and did a bunch of concerts and donated proceeds. Jack Harlow's given more money to the University of Louisville than a lot of prominent black alums. He didn't graduate from the University of Louisville, by the way. He just reps the city. So now when we have the conversation about appropriation, is Jack Harlow in the position to do that if he's not a rapper? And how many black people have been helped by Jack Harlow in those donations? Oh man, all of a sudden we have a conversation about appropriation. It shifts, doesn't it? Y'all thought I was going to go one way, and I zigzagged on y'all. I'm like Lamar. But that's the conversations you can have in class with students, and now you got them engaged. Yeah, try to have a conversation about appropriation with students in the year 2024 about Elvis Presley. You want to see kids fall asleep? They will fall asleep as fast as you can blink. They don't care about Elvis, and it doesn't matter that Baz Luhrmann just did a movie. They don't care. Have the conversation about Jack Harlow and Nappy Roots, and you got them. There was a hand in the back. Yes, sir. Oh, no worries. I appreciate it. As we move closer to 11 o'clock, I want to make sure that we have a broader conversation about the context of LeGarrette King's framework, because I'm a black history expert. This is what I do. But the reality is that if you look at LeGarrette King's framework, anyone who has a marginalized identity can utilize that framework, and you can have the conversation about their history, and I think you can have a fairly robust conversation. If you are unfamiliar with what marginalization means, it's the intentional separation of a group based on a dynamic within their identity, and it is intentionally done. Sometimes that can be for a positive purpose. Many times, however, when we use the context of marginalization, we're thinking about it in the negative. If you are unfamiliar with this definition, you can go to the NIH website. I actually have on this presentation, which I will share with folks, you can click and you can get a lot more information with regard to the definition. This was LeGarrette King's framework. So if we think about this framework, there's really nothing here that has to be black. Power and oppression, take away the word black. Agency, resistance, perseverance. Take away African diaspora and just call it ancient civilization. Take away black joy, just call it joy. Take away the black contemporary, just call it contemporary intersectional historical analysis. You can take this framework, you can apply it to any sort of marginalized identity, and you can have a real conversation about history. Why am I going to share my presentation with you? Because this is way small. I don't know if y'all in the back of the room can even read this. The reality of the Jewish experience in Kentucky is one that you can absolutely apply this framework. Let's talk power and oppression. You all remember what I said, maybe it was about 40 minutes ago now, about elements that are required to be taught in Kentucky schools, required to teach the Holocaust. That's power and oppression. And if you only stop with the murder of millions of Jews and you don't evolve that conversation in any way, shape, or form, that becomes Jewish history for a lot of students. And now we have not dove into any other realities of the Jewish experience. And I grew up in New York City. I know a thing or two about some of those realities because of my friends. Imagine there are folks who are in this room who know a lot about those realities, right? Because that's your identity. Now imagine your kiddos going to school and the only element they hear about is the Holocaust, but they don't really get any other elements about who they are. There's a lot of black kids for whom that's the reality across the country, right? And so if we only talk about the Holocaust, that's the reality for a lot of Jewish students as well. So let's talk about things like agency, resistance, and perseverance. There's evidence that the first Jewish settlers were here in the 1800s, settling this wild, crazy land, putting up log cabins, creating farms. The bourbon industry grows very much in part because of Jewish folks who got into distilling. Maybe we should talk about that in Kentucky. And if we're going to talk ancient civilization, there's no reason that we can't talk about Israel. We absolutely can talk about Holy Land. We can talk about conflict, right? Because we can talk about Christianity, Islam, Judaism. You have three major world religions all in this territory, what the conflict has looked like over time. But we can also talk about the Old Testament. I grew up Christian, so I refer to it as the Old Testament. I know there's the Torah for many people in this room. And this, the idea that this is the land that's promised to the Israelites. And they go, and that's their land, right? Do we tell that story? Let me tell you, I taught this to sixth graders, and I had sixth grade students, Jewish students, who had not heard this in their classrooms. They heard it for Hebrew school, right? And sixth graders, that's Bat Mitzvah time, so they're spending some time on that stuff, right? But we can have this conversation as well, right? As we start to think about joy, there are prominent Jewish Kentuckians, right? Louis Brandeis, born here. How many folks knew that? I may be in this audience, but let me tell you, if I go to Grayson, Kentucky, not so many people knew that, okay? Right? We know about Daniel Boone. You know who was one of the folks who paid Daniel Boone to kind of scout this territory? You can actually find documents from a firm called Cohen and Isaacs. It's got Yiddish on it in the 1780s. Do we talk about that with regard to Daniel Boone? Because maybe we should. All right? Horse racing. American Pharoah wins the Triple Crown. You know that it's a Jewish person who owns that horse. Talk about that? Because if we can talk about horse racing, maybe we can mention that, right? That's an important element of Kentucky's cultural reality. And then as we get into contemporary intersectional historical analysis, you have to get into the complexities of Jewish identity within the Commonwealth, right? So you get into the fact that as a state, Kentucky becomes the first state to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. That's actually in this state where diversity, equity, and inclusion is under attack, that's actually pretty progressive, is it not? We should also get into the conversation around the fact that there were many Jews in the Commonwealth who participated in enslavement by owning slaves, because that's a part of the reality as well. Jefferson Davis, you know who his right hand was? He was a Jewish man. We can have that conversation. And we can have that conversation honestly and talk about how it evolves into what the reality is today for Jewish Kentuckians. And I imagine that you can find a lot of intersection between the experience of Jewish Kentuckians and black Kentuckians with regard to this framework, and you would probably win over quite a few students who maybe aren't hearing about their identity in classrooms. Did I go over? Of course I went over. I'm a teacher, what do I do? This is time for questions, but before we get to questions, I just want you all to know that I have a website, Association for Teaching Black History in Kentucky, atbhk.org. If you are interested in getting more information about any of the things that I've talked about today and other elements of different histories and stories that I haven't talked about, you should go to our website. We have lots of resources. I got a reading list full of children's books. You could read them to your kids this month. Heck, do it in April. Go crazy, right? But I have all sorts of resources that you can certainly utilize. That's me kind of done talking. I'm going to open this water. I'm going to take a drink. And then y'all are going to ask questions. I'm going to try to answer them. We'll see how it goes. Questions, friends?
I think you just mentioned about how a lot of what this is under attack right now. Probably call anti-DEI, but really important for us to read the contemporary context and our ability to continue investing in resources. How are you, I mean, when you're talking to groups like us, or even like groups in government, how are you integrating that and the damage that that can do? And what are some efforts that you're hearing about or are part of that people are doing to help support?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking the question. Incidentally, I'm working on my PhD with an emphasis in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Very specifically, they're trying to make sure I can't graduate. That's what, I mean, that bill is post-secondary, get DEI stuff out of the University of Kentucky. It's only funny because I laugh to keep from crying because I got to get my dissertation done, right? When I have conversations, many times it's rooms of professional educators, teachers, so I don't really have to explain to them the complexities of the legislation because they know it because they have to live it, right? And so a lot of times what I talk to them about is just making sure that they fully understand legislation that's already been passed. So like, for example, I was working for the Pritchard Committee. I was working with legislators to make sure that fake anti-CRT legislation didn't pass. We still got some stuff passed. What passed, it's not what passed in Texas, it's not what passed in Florida. There's still a lot of things that we can do. In fact, what it did was it crystallized the fact that we have to talk about things like letters from a Birmingham jail. When's the last time you all read letters from a Birmingham jail? Let me just tell you, when the state legislature sees me in the classroom teaching letters from a Birmingham jail, they're going to take that out of the legislation because I'm going to talk about the white moderate. And they're not going to be happy about that. But Dr. King talked about it, and he told me I got to talk about this document, so I guess y'all just messed up. Maybe somebody should have read it before you told me I had to talk about it, right? And so there are elements that we actually can lean into, which is one of the reasons why I talk about Dr. King, because you have to do letters from Birmingham jail, I have a dream, so you can lean into that. With regard to groups like this one that may not have professional educators, normally the question comes from the audience, and then we just have the conversation to make sure that folks understand what's happening in your state legislature. Now, Louisville, in general, is a place where it's not your legislators who are trying to push this legislation, right? And the reality in the Commonwealth, and it's not just the Commonwealth of Kentucky, it's across the United States, is that this is a part of GOP tactics. And so we just have to understand that that's galvanizing power. This is not anti-GOP, by the way. If you are a Republican, that is abundantly fine. I don't have a problem with you. The piece with regard to strategy, like you can go look it up. It's the conservative think tanks that are creating these strategies. So that's the honest truth. Sometimes honesty gets misconstrued, but that's the honest truth. I worked at the Pritchard Committee. I know exactly what's done. In fact, in working at the Pritchard Committee, I created an equity toolkit. I would encourage you to go on the Pritchard Committee's website, pull up the equity toolkit, and it talks about how you can get folks together in your community to have conversations like this one. So what can folks in this room do? Go there. Pull up that equity toolkit. Engage with folks in your local community so that you can give them the power to have conversations with folks in their personal spheres. As we think about organizations that are really fully engaged in this work, if you're unfamiliar with Ed Trust, you should get to know Ed Trust. You should support the work that they're doing because across the entirety of these United States, they're actually attempting to combat these types of legislative pieces that are coming out. And they're working diligently and trying to find partners in states across the country, including Kentucky. I'm working with an individual. So if you are very interested in that work, like I can have a very personal conversation with you and very much give you his phone number so you can text him and talk about the work that you're hoping to do. So hopefully that addresses all elements of your question. Other questions, friends, please. Okay, quick story. If you are around my age, I'm 43. If you're around my age, you will remember the Peterson's College Guide. I think that now that's like a website, right? But once upon a time, the Peterson's College Guide used to be a book that was this thick. Y'all remember? Awesome. You remember the CD-ROM that used to be in the back? Awesome. You remember computer labs? Because now we don't really have those kind of, so we had all the Macs set up, and you had the CD-ROM, so we put the CD-ROM in, and we were joking around. Mr. Sullivan's computer class, I was a junior in high school, put the CD-ROM in, and you can search any college that you want based on different criteria, qualifications. We put in $0 tuition and try to figure out what would come up. 2 schools came up. Cooper Union, if you're unfamiliar with Cooper Union, it's an architecture and engineering school in New York City, and it was $0 tuition. That's evolved. The alumni base is not happy about it. The other school that came up was Berea College. So I always remembered Berea. And then I was running the ball, got my arm all tore up. I needed a scholarship, wasn't going to play in the NFL. Figured, hey, I should probably go check out that place that was $0 tuition. And that's how I ended up at Berea. Met my wife there. Things have worked out pretty well for me. Other questions? Please.
Well, I have some questions. So we are at this table as educators. We work at Early Learning Center over at the JCC.
Very cool.
Yeah, thanks. So you guys been through pre-kindergarten, and we have actually been talking a little bit about Black history and how to view Black history with young children, but we don't know what to do. I feel like we got a lot of good ideas today. Like, I really love your focus on local history, and that's something we talk about a lot with those kids. Like, there's no reason to talk about the rainforest with young children living in Little Kentucky, right? So we try to make things make sense for them and for their real world. But I guess I'm wondering if there's any, like, secret cache of resources or, like, something that we need to know about or we can bring them into the school.
One secret cache of resources, atbhk.org.
I already scanned the thing.
Awesome. Awesome.
Top floor.
Something else to consider, and I think that you guys are already thinking about this strategy intentionally, is this idea of localized elements. And so I was in a school in Lexington at the beginning of this month. I've been going back to this school for the last 3 or 4 years. What they do is they bring in local, prominent Black people to just have conversations with their kids. And they do it during Black History Month very intentionally. It's a part of a whole program. There's an opportunity to consider, like, can we bring in folks from our local community to reinforce the conversations that we're having about locality, community, with our preschoolers? And so what I would say is consider that, consider who you could bring in. What I would also encourage you to do is, don't actually do what that school is doing. That school is doing as a part of a Black History Month conversation. I would encourage you to just find prominent Louisvillians and bring them in all the time and make sure that they are representative of the students who you have in your class, right? If you have students who identify as East Asian, we should have someone who's East Asian who can come in and have a conversation. We have people who are from Indian subcontinent, we should have someone who reflects that identity. And the great thing about Louisville, you can find those folks. Sometimes in Grayson, Kentucky, you can't always. So hopefully it feels like you have resources and folks you can reach out to. And I don't think that there's anyone who would say no to like a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. They might be scared, but they won't say no.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Question in the back? If you are interested in having young people actually come have these conversations with your students, I think that there's a resource in the back of the room. Hey, look at that hidden cache. Other questions, friends? Please. No worries. Here's what JCPS actually does really well, but it doesn't get publicized very well. They actually have an entire department that's kind of focused in this space, and it falls under the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And so they have an entire department. They have conversations about curriculum. They actually put out like a monthly magazine that talks about some of the elements around curriculum, some of the people within JCPS who are leading the work. They try to highlight folks of diverse identities so you can see them represented across JCPS schools. So Jefferson County is actually really doing some great work in the space. I want to say that the numbers are somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of folks identifying as Black in JCPS. And so they do intentional work around belonging, and they think intentionally about curriculum. So there's a lot of work that's being done. It's actually probably a lot of best practice work that a lot of other communities can look at. Not everyone is Louisville. So part of the trouble that I run into is that if I go down to Johnson County and say, go look at what Louisville is doing, that's the last thing that they want to hear, right? That being said, we're in Louisville here, and so you can certainly take advantage of those resources in JCPS, absolutely. There's a lot of racism out there where I live, in case you missed that. Here's the reality, too, right, is that I imagine that we all can look and identify prejudice, racism, bias, bigotry. One of the commonalities, I remember, gosh, just going like 15 years ago, having this conversation around the unit that I taught with regard to Israel, was that you can actually have a conversation where folks who are of Jewish identity and folks who are of black identity can really actually have some robust conversations about the facts that they've been discriminated against at different points in their life. I never want to spend like the entirety of a class kind of mired in that negativity, but that's a reality, right? Like we can certainly point to examples of anti-Semitism, examples of anti-black racism. I mean, the reason why the University of Kentucky got their program around diversity, equity, and inclusion is because Breonna Taylor was murdered in this city. That's why it happened. So that's the reality of Kentucky's history as well. So we know that we can certainly point to those examples, and hopefully what we can do is find ways to combat, right? Hopefully you feel like there's some resources to have conversations with young people. Frankly, sometimes we're just too old and stubborn, but you can talk to a 12-year-old, and you'd be surprised what can get through there. You can't talk to them once. You know what 12-year-olds are like. You got to talk to them multiple times. But you keep plugging those messages, and you'd be surprised how those things seep in. And the next thing you know, they are facilitators talking to other young people. It's happening here in terms of combating anti-black racism, anti-Semitism, anti-anyism, right? We just have to find those pockets. We have to find the cash, right? Other questions? It's only just after 11:15. I think that 11:15 was when I was supposed to wrap. So y'all kept me on time. Friends, thank you for your time. I certainly appreciate it. I think that there's a lunch coming, and I was told to not keep you guys away from lunch. So I certainly will not do that. Thank you. I will be here. Thank you. I will be here. I have business cards. I also have some swag. Like if you're interested in stickers or pens or lanyards, like I got stuff. Just come by. You don't even have to say hi. Just grab some stuff because you're helping me by marketing the program. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right. So I know we just gave him a rousing round of applause, but that was incredible, wasn't it? That was incredibly captivating, and I learned a lot. Probably the most important thing all of us should have learned from that is what? ATBHK.org, right? Because you said it many times, but I think it's
ATBHK.org. Of course, I don't have it on. ATBHK.org.
But I think some of you have heard me say this as well, is that there's a big difference. One of the biggest differences between Mr. Cummings and I is that when he walks into a room, people will automatically think a certain thing about him. When I walk in the room, if I don't announce my heritage, I can blend. So we do have a lot more in common than sometimes our cultures accept and think about. And I think, and moving forward, that's the kind of conversations we need to keep having. So thank you very much for today.
Thank you.